all may have made plans for last year and for the one ahead, but the global pandemic changed everything. For one determined New York City nurse, it hasn't stopped her from pursuing her educational and career goals. Erin Hartman is a Penn graduate in nursing with a passion for public policy work. After spending a year on the ground working in a New York City emergency department, Erin felt called to pursue a career in public policy with a focus on health. While working her demanding, high-stress job as a nurse, Erin applied and was accepted to a master's program with University of York in York, England. While there are plenty of challenges to online schooling, Erin has found the benefits to virtual not only in the classroom, but in medical research. In the face of all this uncertainty, Erin continues to be a resilient force to be reckoned with. On this week's episode, we'll discuss Erin's experiences as an ER nurse, her interest in and transition to public policy, plus the challenges and opportunities of going virtual. I'm Victoria Principato, and this is Yuptown. It is my great honor to introduce the one and only Erin Hartman as part of this week's episode of Yuptown. Erin, welcome to the show.
Wow, thanks for having me. This is such an honor.
It's so exciting to have you here. Someday when we're looking at this in the archives, I'm going to say I had Erin Hartman on my show. Yeah. So Erin, why don't you start out giving us a little bit of an introduction and a little bit about your background?
Sure thing. So I grew up in South Jersey, and I went to Penn for my undergrad. I graduated in 2018, and I studied, I was in the School of Nursing, and I studied health economics with a focus on health policy. I did a bunch of things when I was an undergrad that kind of led me to becoming interested in violence against women work. So one of the things that I always talk about is the summer after my sophomore year, I interned with the Senate, which I believe you were also in DC that summer, right?
I was. We were there at the same time, yeah.
At turns the same time. And that was the summer that the quote unquote Stanford rape case happened. So it was Barack Turner's case. And the women's health staffer that I was working for, that I was kind of focusing my work with, was doing some legislation around the issue. We were doing some Title IX, which is the title within the Education Act that prevents the discrimination on the basis of sex. So that's kind of what governs sexual assault proceedings on college campuses. Anyway, we were doing some of that work, and I was like, wow, this issue is like something that's so important. It's so pertinent. It's so pervasive. And I was like, wow, I feel like as a nurse, I could be in a good position to focus on this issue within policy. And I kind of went off of that and started working for the World Health Organization the next summer, focusing on their violence against women team. That summer, we worked on a curriculum to train healthcare students and nurses and docs on how to respond to sexual violence. And it had a specific focus on low and middle income countries, which led me to helping to lead a training that brought in practitioners from all around the world. And one common theme is that they all kind of focused on conflict and emergency settings. So they were focusing on doing this work in humanitarian contexts. And another theme of that was that they all went to school in London, which is kind of what got me interested in.
Just to dial back a tiny bit. So you have like all this interest in public policy. When you were applying to school and like looking at colleges to go to, why did you apply in nursing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I do feel like, I don't know if you would agree about this, but I feel like it's so challenging when you're in high school to figure out what to study in college.
Yeah, and that's what this show is all about. Like, how are we supposed to know at the young age of 18 what you want to do with the rest of your life? Like,
exactly. And especially going into something that really like would pigeonhole you in a sense. And so when I was 18, having these, conversations and kind of thinking about what I wanted to do, I knew I always wanted to go into the healthcare field. I think that it's interesting because that was really never a question, except no one in my family is in the healthcare field. So it's not like I had a ton of exposure and knew that that's what I was supposed to do. But when I was applying to schools, I was kind of looking at what programs would give me the most flexibility to try to figure out where I could see myself in the healthcare field. I didn't know if I wanted to be a nurse. I didn't know if I wanted to go to med school. At the time, I didn't even really know what health policy was. I didn't know if I wanted to go into, hospital administration. And so that's why I ended up at Penn, because I did find that their program and just being at the university would give me the most exposure to all the different types of roles and ways you can be involved and work within the healthcare industry.
Gotcha.
And it was actually, I kind of had a crisis my freshman year, because I was enrolled in nursing and I was like, okay, I'll just ride this out. We'll see how this goes. I think that I want to be a nurse. I always felt like nurses had the most exposure to patients. And so if you want to work on any other type of issue, I was like, well, it's best to have a foundation of nursing. But my freshman year, my first semester, I took an economics class. I took a macro econ class. And I love economics. I still to this day in this really nerdy way. And I kind of was like, wow, I'm a nursing student. I'm not going to be able to take any more econ classes. And I almost dropped out of nursing. I'm glad that I didn't. And I, in trying to figure out, oh, should I drop out? What should I do? I met a professor who was the dean actually of my freshman dorm building. And she's a nurse and her PhD is in health econ. And she worked under Clinton and Obama, specifically under Obama on the ACA. And she ran workforce issues. So saying we have this new piece of legislation that we're rolling out. Millions and more people are going to have access to healthcare. How are we making sure that we have enough nurses to give them care, right? Because it's one thing to say, oh, you now have insurance, you can have access to a primary care provider and you can go to the hospital and we'll take care of you. But who's going to actually take care of these people? How are we increasing nurses? How are we educating nurses? And so I really saw how she was able to marry both of those worlds, and how having a nursing background helped her and inform her policy and economic decisions.
Right, because it's from the ground up, how can you enable all these policies if you don't know how it actually will work and be put into practice?
Yeah, I think that's my motto for sure. I think,
Yeah.
You shouldn't be a superintendent of a school if you've never been a teacher.
Exactly. Exactly.
And
Right. So then fast forward to after you graduate, you're a nurse in New York City. What was that like?
yeah, so after I graduated in 2018, I moved to New York. I started working at New York Presbyterian, their Cornell campus in the Upper East Side. I started working in the emergency department, which was definitely a wild ride. I think it is the best, and I would also argue the worst parts of nursing all wrapped in together. But ultimately, I feel like I learned a lot, and I do think it was a lot of fun. My favorite part of the job, going back to the violence against women interest, is I was able to get certified as a sexual assault nurse examiner. And so what that entailed would be picking up on-call shifts throughout the month. And the on-call shifts would be a 12-hour period, and had to make sure I was within an hour distance of the hospital and had my phone near me. And if someone came to the emergency department, or if they presented to a police station or a fire station, disclosing that they experienced some sort of sexual violence, then they would call one of these examiners in, and we'd go in and respond. And the hospital had a motto of you were only supposed to ask the patient their story once, right? So if they say, oh, I experienced sexual violence, then they immediately call in the examiner. They don't ask them any more questions, because it is really re-traumatizing to have to tell your story over and over again. And it is totally unnecessary. We go in, meet with the patient, and can provide a bunch of different services, and also getting their story and giving them follow-up resources and making sure they have a safety plan that they can go home and be safe, and not have to worry wherever they're supposed to go home. We'd also give them like emergency contraception, and prophylactic medications for sexually transmitted infections.
So you're doing all of these things in New York and, making such an incredible impact on your community. How did you know that it was time to go back to school? Did you have this plan in mind before you started nursing? And was it challenging saying goodbye to that part of your career?
Yeah, I think I really liked being a nurse. I like will stand by this that I think it's always going to be the hardest job I've ever had, and the most rewarding. And I think it's really unique to be able to have such a pulse on what's going on and be able to really feel like you are touching individuals, and making a difference for them. I kind of always planned to go back to school after 2 years. So once I kind of hit that 1 year mark, I was like, all right, what am I going to do? How am I going to make this work? And started looking into different programs. And for me, like just to plug definitely, for like looking for like fellowship opportunities, that was a big thing for me. I wasn't in a position and didn't feel comfortable with trying to take on more like student loans. And so I really pursued every avenue that I could find, to get funding to go back to school. But I do think I always had this idea of 2 years out. I thought that 2 years was a good amount of time to get my feet wet and feel like I did have some nursing experience, under my belt.
Right. And what I do admire about how you did this is that you kind of had that plan in mind and then gave yourself a deadline and stuck to it. You said 2 years like of working, but you were proactive after 1 year, which I think is something that I struggle with personally. So
Yeah.
I really do admire that you were able to keep that schedule for yourself.
Because I went into it kind of always having that in the back of my mind.
Mhm.
But I will say it's like so hard to be working and applying for
Oh,
graduate school and figuring these things out. It was so much easier, I think, when we were undergrads to, apply for job opportunities and apply for internships and write applications and essays. But once you're working, in your case, a 9 to 5 or 3 12-hour shifts a week, it's really hard to kind of switch that framework in your mind.
in school, you have all those resources immediately available to you, but when you're working, you kind of have to navigate that for yourself. So I completely agree. But can you tell us a little bit more about the program that you're in now and what your goal is in pursuing this additional degree? Like how exactly do you hope to reposition your career with this program?
Great. So I am currently at the University of York, in England, and I'm doing an LLM. So it's a law master's in international and human rights law. And it's an applied master's. So it really focuses on, teaching us how to be like human rights practitioners and doing research. But I kind of wanting, again, to do violence against women work and wanting to focus this on conflict related settings. I kind of recognize the role that international law comes into play, how international law comes into play. And so the LLM that I'm doing is pretty unique in that it trains people who are not only lawyers, but just people who want to go into academia or want to go into practice that is going to be impacted by the law. So for example, in conflict situations, if you're responding to sexual violence, all of the organizations that are working on the ground and all of the responses that they're giving are mandated by international law. And it's these bigger organizations, that are, such as the UN and the Global Protection Cluster that are coordinating these responses on the ground. So I kind of wanted to have an understanding of that. And in addition, I think in conflict settings, when you're working on this issue, there's this unique element of international law does have an impact on like criminal proceedings. So I became very interested in the International Criminal Court and the International Court of Justice and how that could play an impact on individual survivors in these settings.
I couldn't think of anyone better to do that work and to take that on just so head on as you have, I mean, like you've done everything that you can to have a full understanding of every situation from the ground up. And I think that's what's going to make the greatest impact. So you kind of know where you're going with this degree, but I mean, I know you're pursuing it during a global pandemic.
Oh, there's a global pandemic
There is
going
a
on?
little bit of a I don't know
had
if you
no idea.
may have heard. So what challenges have you faced in trying to pivot your career during such a unstable time?
Aside from getting COVID myself.
Yeah.
Honestly, and I'm sure like everyone can relate to this, there is this just feeling of like floating this year, of kind of like being lost and not feeling very grounded. And I think for me, it's been hard because I moved to England, but half of the time that I was there, I was restricted. I was still in lockdown. So it was really hard to kind of make that a home and to build strong ties there. And then I came home now for Christmas. And then there's a new mutation running rampant in the UK. And so they shut the whole country down again. And so there is a sense of like, I don't even know when I'm going to be able to go back. It's just been challenging in the sense that I feel like I took on this endeavor to move and to create a new life over there. And now I'm back and I don't really feel like I have too much going on here. And again, I do think it's hard to transition from like working to being in school. I think especially my nursing shifts were a lot different from doing academic work. I would wake up early in the morning and go and work all day and be physically exhausted, come home, go to bed, not think about it. Or come home and you don't have any work to do outside of work, versus when you're in school, it's like it never ends. Like there's
Yes.
always something that you could be, reading. There's always like something that you need to be studying. There's always people
Something
that you
to
need
edit, something to improve,
yeah,
always.
totally. So that has been hard. And again, just the sense of like uncertainty and kind of feeling a little like we're all floating, but I am cognizant of the fact that I think it would have been similar if I was in the US going back to school. I have friends in the US who did start master's programs, law programs, are in medical school and are in similar positions where they're studying in locations they didn't expect to be.
Yeah, because I mean, yes, I'm not going to use the word unprecedented. I refuse. But this incredibly unusual time, there must be some unique opportunities that you have as a student that you might not have otherwise had you been in a traditional classroom setting.
No, definitely. I think that when my program was just starting, we did this like info session with one of the directors, and he was saying how this is going to totally change the work of like the human rights field. And I definitely think global health in general in positive ways. Like, I think we need to think about like what was the ethics and sustainability of hosting conferences where people were traveling via airplane from all over the world and needing to find childcare and needing to get like the funds to attend conferences, versus now they're virtual and it's so much more accessible.
Right.
I think the pandemic in that way has kind of made information way more accessible to people. I think there's a ton of courses that are now offered online, and people can do online degrees that they otherwise wouldn't have the time or wouldn't be able to relocate themselves or their families in order to be able to do. So I think in that way, it's going to be really positive. I think it's just opening up information and networking to so many people that it was perhaps otherwise inaccessible to. I even think with research, it's going to give people, I mean, there's so many like ethical questions of like, should we be doing research in these really fragile settings? And is it ethical, depending upon who you are, like to go into these contexts and do research? But now that we can do things like via Zoom and Skype, yes, it like takes away the one-to-one connection that we all definitely do better with. But at the same time, I think it makes research a lot more accessible and perhaps more ethical and sustainable.
There, I love that. See, Erin, I knew you could find the silver lining,
We found it somehow. But
couldn't agree with you more. Well, thank you so much, Erin, for being on the show. Everyone appreciates your insights and your words of wisdom. And I think it's important to kind of have these conversations of like, hey, this isn't always like perfect and it always has its challenges. And I think like it's important to also highlight that people are facing, especially now.
Yeah. Sometimes I think it's just one foot in front of the other. That's all you can do.